My name is Robert Hayes. I am 67 years old, and I live in a small town outside Asheville, North Carolina. For almost 40 years, my alarm clock rang before the sun touched the mountains. While most people were still asleep, I was already awake, standing in my kitchen with a cup of coffee in my hand, preparing myself for another day of solving problems that other people could not solve. That was my life. Not glamorous, not impressive to people who measure success by the size of a house or the number of expensive things sitting in a driveway. But it was honest. I was an engineer at a manufacturing company, and for decades I gave that place everything I had. I watched younger employees come and go. I watched technology change. I watched entire departments disappear and get rebuilt. Through all of it, I stayed. I stayed because I believed work meant something. I believed your name should mean something when people said it. Not because you were famous. Not because you were wealthy. Because people knew they could depend on you. That was the kind of man I tried to be. A dependable man. Quiet man. A man who showed up. For most of my life, I never cared about recognition. I never needed applause. I never wanted people to know every difficult thing I had done. I thought the people closest to me already knew. I was wrong. After my wife passed away, my world became smaller. Her death left a silence in my house that never fully disappeared. There are some losses that don't heal. They simply become part of you. You learn how to carry them. But I still had Claire, my daughter, the one person I believed would always understand me. After losing her mother, I became even more protective of her. I knew she had lost someone too, and I wanted to make sure she never felt alone. So I did what fathers do. I sacrificed. When Claire wanted to continue her education, I helped pay for it. When she struggled financially after graduation, I was there. When she wanted to buy her first home, I helped her make it possible. I never considered those things burdens. They were gifts. They were the things a father does without hesitation. I never sat down with Claire and reminded her how much I had done. I never said, "Remember who helped you." Love is not supposed to be a debt collection. At least that is what I believed. For years, Claire and I were close. She would call me when she needed advice. She would ask what I thought about important decisions. She would come over for dinner, and for a while I felt like I still had the family I had fought so hard to protect. Then Andrew entered her life. At first I tried. I really did. I wanted to give him a fair chance because he made my daughter happy. And any father wants to see his child happy. Andrew was successful. That was the first thing everyone noticed about him. He had a good career. He wore expensive watches. He talked about business trips and investments and places he had visited. He knew how to make people listen, and I respected that. But over time, I noticed something about Andrew. Everything with him seemed to be a competition. Every conversation became a measurement. Who earned more? Who owned more? Who had achieved more? And slowly, without saying it directly, he started making me feel like I had fallen behind. He would ask about my work with a strange smile. "Still doing engineering?" he once asked. The words were simple. The tone was not. It was the tone someone uses when they are surprised a person has not moved on from something they consider beneath them. I remember looking at him and forcing a smile. "Yes," I said. 40 years of experience. 40 years of solving problems. 40 years of waking up every morning and earning my place. Reduced to one sentence. Still doing engineering? I ignored it. At least I tried to. I told myself Andrew was young. I told myself different generations saw success differently. I told myself that Claire knew who I was. But slowly, I started seeing changes in her too. That was the part that hurt. Not Andrew. Claire. She began repeating his opinions. She started describing my life in ways I had never heard from her before. She would say things like, "Dad, maybe you should think about retirement." Or, "Dad, you don't have to work so hard anymore." At first, those words sounded caring. But eventually, I realized there was something underneath them. She wasn't worried about me. She was embarrassed by me. That realization was painful, because I had spent years trying to make her proud. And somehow, I had become someone she wanted to hide. I noticed it at family gatherings. The way Andrew would talk about his achievements while barely asking about mine. The way Claire would laugh at his jokes but stay quiet when he criticized my choices. The way conversations about my work would end quickly, while conversations about Andrew's career could last for hours. I began feeling like a guest in my own daughter's life. A person who was tolerated, not valued. Still, I stayed quiet, because fathers are taught to endure. We are taught to provide. We are taught that our children do not always see our sacrifices when they are young. I told myself Claire would eventually understand. Maybe one day she would look back and realize that the man she was beginning to dismiss was the same man who had spent decades making sure she never had to struggle. Maybe one day she would see me clearly. But that day never came. The final crack happened during a family dinner. It was an ordinary evening. That was what made it worse. There was no warning, no argument, no dramatic moment leading up to it. Just a table, a meal, and three people who no longer saw each other the same way. I remember sitting there and looking at Claire. For a moment, I saw the little girl she used to be. The girl who would run to me when she was scared. The girl who believed I could fix anything. I wondered where that girl had gone. Then Andrew placed his glass down. He looked at me and said, "Robert, I think it's time you stop working." I smiled. I thought he was making a suggestion. Then he continued. He told me my little job was making Claire look bad in front of their friends. He said people noticed that I was still working at my age. He said it made no sense for someone like me to keep holding onto a position that younger people should have. Someone like me. I heard those words clearly. Someone like me. A man who had spent his life building. A man who had supported his family. A man who had given everything quietly. Now I was someone who needed to disappear. I looked at Claire, waiting. Not for her to attack him. Not for her to start a fight. Just for her to say one sentence. "Andrew, that's not fair." But she didn't. She sat there, silent. And that silence told me everything. So I smiled. I nodded. I did not defend myself. I did not explain my accomplishments. I did not tell them what I knew, because they had already made their decision about me. They believed my work was insignificant. They believed I was old. They believed my best days were behind me. But they did not know the truth. They had no idea what my little job actually represented. They had no idea that the years they mocked were connected to something much bigger than they could imagine. They did not know that the man they were pushing aside was standing closer to the biggest achievement of his career. And I was going to let them believe whatever they wanted. Because sometimes people reveal their true feelings when they think you have nothing left to offer. And sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one who knows the most. After that dinner, something inside me changed. Not immediately. Not with anger. Not with shouting. The people who hurt you the deepest are often the people who expect the biggest reaction. They expect you to defend yourself. They expect you to argue. They expect you to prove them wrong. But I had spent my entire life proving myself. To my employers. To my family. To everyone who doubted whether quiet dedication was enough. That night, sitting across from Claire and Andrew, I realized something painful. I was tired. Not physically. I had carried heavier things than exhaustion. I was tired of trying to convince people who had already decided not to see me. When I left their house that evening, I drove home through the dark roads outside Asheville with my hands tight around the steering wheel. The mountains were quiet. The streets were empty. And for the first time in years, I admitted something to myself. My daughter did not need me the way I needed her. That was a difficult truth for a father to accept. A father spends his whole life believing his child will always be the one person who remembers everything. The scraped knees, the school projects, the sleepless nights, the sacrifices nobody else witnessed. But sometimes children grow up and become strangers. Sometimes they inherit someone else's judgment. And sometimes they forget who stood beside them before anyone else cared. When I arrived home that night, I did not turn on the television. I did not make dinner. I simply sat in my study. That room had been my refuge for decades. Shelves filled with engineering books, old photographs, awards I never displayed, memories of a life built through patience. I looked around and thought about how strange it was. The same man they considered ordinary had spent his entire life creating things that mattered. But none of that mattered to them. Not because it was worthless, because they had stopped respecting the person who created it. That was the difference. I could accept being unnoticed. I could accept not being celebrated. But being looked down on by my own daughter was something different. That was a wound that reached deeper. Over the next few weeks, things became colder. Claire called less. When she did call, our conversations felt forced. She would ask how I was, but it sounded like a question asked out of obligation, not concern. Andrew, meanwhile, seemed more comfortable than ever. He continued talking about his career, his success, his plans. And every conversation carried the same hidden message. You should know your place. I began noticing how often he corrected me. How often he dismissed my opinions. How often Claire let him. That was the part one could never understand. A stranger disrespecting me was one thing. My daughter allowing it was another. I never expected Claire to choose sides. I never wanted her to fight with her husband. I only wanted her to remember who I was. Her father. The man who stayed. The man who helped. The man who never walked away. But memory is a strange thing. People remember what benefits them. They remember the help when they need it. They remember the sacrifices when they are desperate. But when life becomes comfortable, they sometimes forget who made that comfort possible. I returned to work after that dinner with a different mindset. Before, I worked because I enjoyed solving problems, because I loved engineering, because creating something useful gave my life purpose. Now, I worked because I knew something they didn't. For years, my team and I had been developing a new industrial equipment system. It was not the kind of project that attracted attention immediately. There were no cameras, no public announcements, no reason for my family to care. But I knew what it could become. I knew the potential. I had spent years refining designs, testing solutions, correcting failures, and pushing through problems that would have made others quit. The project had become a part of me. Every engineer who worked on it knew the importance. But outside those walls, nobody understood. Especially not my family. To them, I was just an older man refusing to retire. A man clinging to a small job. A man who should step aside. They had no idea that the very thing they mocked was the reason my future was about to change. I never told Claire. I never told Andrew. Not because I wanted revenge. Not because I wanted to surprise them. I simply stopped feeling the need to explain myself. That was new for me. For most of my life, I had been the person who explained. The person who solved. The person who fixed. But this time, I wanted to see what happened when I stopped trying to earn respect. The answer came sooner than I expected. A few months after that dinner, Andrew invited me to another family gathering. His message was polite. Too polite. The kind of politeness people use when they want something. I almost declined. But something told me to go. Maybe part of me wanted to see if anything had changed. Maybe some small part of me still hoped Claire would realize what had happened. When I arrived, Andrew greeted me with a smile. A different smile. Careful one. He asked about work. For the first time in years, he sounded interested. I noticed. I said nothing. People reveal themselves when circumstances change. And I was beginning to understand that Andrew's respect had never been about me. It was about what he thought I represented. That night, I watched Claire and Andrew move around the room. They looked successful. They looked comfortable. They looked like people who believed they had everything figured out. And maybe they did. Except they had made one mistake. They underestimated me. They thought my silence meant weakness. They thought my age meant irrelevance. They thought the years I spent working quietly had produced nothing valuable. They were wrong. Very wrong. Because while they were judging my past, I was building my future. And then, one morning, the phone call came. The call I had been waiting years for. The company had finalized negotiations. The project was moving forward. The technology we had created was being sold. And the number attached to the deal was far beyond anything my family could have imagined. Millions of dollars. A lifetime of work finally recognized. I sat at my desk after that call and stared out the window. I should have felt victorious. I should have felt satisfied. But the only thing I felt was sadness. Because the people I wanted to share that moment with were the same people who had made me feel like I had nothing worth sharing. That was when I understood something. Success does not repair disrespect. Money does not heal humiliation. And achievements do not erase the pain of being dismissed by the people you love. A few months earlier, Claire and Andrew had looked at me like I was someone who needed to disappear. Soon the world would know my name. But I wondered if they would finally see me, or if they would only see what I had become. 6 months after that dinner, the world finally discovered what my family had already decided was worthless. The article was published on a Tuesday morning. I remember that day clearly. There was nothing dramatic about the beginning. No warning. No special moment. Just my usual routine. Coffee in the kitchen. The sound of birds outside my window. The morning newspaper resting on my table. I had spent my entire career watching other people receive recognition for work that happened quietly behind the scenes. I never expected my name to be the one people noticed. But there it was, printed clearly. Robert Hayes, one of the engineers responsible for the technology behind the company's latest project. The article explained the details of the sale, the negotiations, the impact, the future of the system we had spent years developing. The number was impossible for most people to ignore. $4.2 million. A deal large enough to make headlines. Large enough to make people suddenly interested in the man they had dismissed. I read the article slowly, not because I was surprised. I already knew, but because I was thinking about something else. I was thinking about that dinner. Andrew's voice. Claire's silence. My little job. Those words had stayed with me for months. Funny how a sentence can remain in your mind long after the person who said it has forgotten it. People often think disrespect disappears if enough time passes. It doesn't. It waits, sits quietly, and sometimes the person who caused the wound eventually discovers exactly how deep they cut. By noon, my phone started ringing. First, it was Andrew. I looked at the screen. His name appeared there. I watched it. I did not answer. For years, I had answered every call from Claire, every call from family, every request, every problem. I had always been available. But that day, I let the phone ring. A strange thing happens when you stop chasing people. You find out who was actually coming toward you. The calls continued. Messages appeared. Robert, we need to talk. Robert. I think there was a misunderstanding. Robert, please call me back. A misunderstanding. That was the word he chose. A misunderstanding. As if telling someone their life's work was insignificant was simply a mistake in communication. As if humiliation could be erased by choosing softer words afterward. I ignored the messages. Not because I wanted revenge. I was not interested in revenge. Revenge keeps you connected to people who hurt you. I wanted something else. Distance. For the first time in years, I wanted distance. Later that afternoon, Claire called. I almost answered. That surprised me. Because no matter what happened, she was still my daughter. Part of me still wanted to hear her voice. A part of me still wanted to believe there was something left to save. But then I remembered that dinner. I remembered looking across the table at the person I raised. The person I protected. The person who watched someone insult me and chose silence. So I let it ring. That evening, Claire came to my house. I saw her car pull into the driveway. I sat in my living room and waited. A few years earlier, I would have rushed to the door. Not anymore. The person standing outside my house was my daughter. But she was also the person who had allowed me to become a stranger in her life. When I opened the door, she looked different. Not physically. Something else. The confidence she had carried before was gone. She looked uncertain. Almost ashamed. Dad, she said quietly. That word sounded different. Not because I had forgotten it. Because I remembered when it meant something. I let her inside. I offered her coffee. Old habits. Even after everything, I was still the man who offered comfort. That was something I had to learn about myself. People can hurt you deeply, and you can still remain the person you were. She sat across from me. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Finally, she looked down and said, "I owe you an apology." I waited, not because I wanted her to suffer, because I wanted to know if she truly understood. She told me Andrew's comments had changed the way she saw things. She admitted that she had started measuring people by appearances, by money, by status. She admitted she had been embarrassed that I was still working. The words were painful, but they were honest. For the first time in months, Claire was not defending him. She was admitting what happened. She told me she remembered everything. The education payments, the help with the house, the times I showed up when nobody else did. She said she had forgotten. I looked at her and felt something break inside me. Not anger, something worse. Sadness. Because forgetting is not always accidental. Sometimes people forget because remembering would force them to admit they were wrong. "I never needed you to be impressed by me, Claire," I told her. My voice was calm. "I never needed you to tell people I was successful. I never needed you to brag about me. I only needed you to respect me." She wiped her eyes. "I know." But I shook my head. "No, you know now." That difference mattered. People often learn lessons only after consequences arrive. They understand the value of something after losing access to it. And I could not ignore that. A few weeks earlier, my family had looked at me as if I had nothing. Now they were looking at the same man differently. Not because I had changed, because their perception had. And that was the part that hurt the most. My value had never changed. Only their willingness to recognize it. Andrew eventually came to my house too. He was different. The confidence was gone. The arrogance had disappeared. He stood at my door and apologized. He said he was proud of me. I listened. Then I asked him one question. "Would you have said that if the article was never published?" He had no answer. That silence told me everything. Because respect that appears only after success is not respect. It is admiration for what someone can provide. And I was tired of being valued for what I could give. I wanted to be valued for who I was. The man. Not the money. The father. Not the achievement. The person. Not the result. That was the lesson I carried forward. The article changed how the world saw me. But it also revealed something much more important. It revealed how my family had truly seen me all along. And once you understand that, you cannot go back. You can forgive. Maybe. You can move forward. Eventually. But you never forget the moment people finally recognize your worth only after they realize they can no longer ignore it. After everything happened, I expected to feel something different. I thought success would feel like victory. I thought seeing the same people who had dismissed me finally understand my worth would bring satisfaction. But it didn't. The truth is, achievements cannot repair wounds caused by the people you love. A newspaper article can announce your accomplishments to the world. A business deal can change your financial future. A lifetime of hard work can finally receive recognition. But none of those things can give you back the moments when you needed respect and received silence instead. That was the part nobody understood. People looked at the article and saw success. They saw the number. They saw the opportunity. They saw a man who had suddenly become important. But they did not see the years before that. They did not see the early mornings, the long nights, the sacrifices, the moments when I chose responsibility over comfort. They saw the reward. They never saw the cost. After the news spread, my relationship with Claire changed. Not overnight. Real damage does not disappear because someone says sorry. An apology can open a door, but it cannot rebuild a house that has already collapsed. Claire tried. I will give her that. She called more often. She visited. She asked about my work. She wanted to know about the project, the years I spent creating something she had once considered insignificant. But every conversation carried the weight of what happened. Because once someone shows you how they truly see you, it becomes difficult to forget. I loved my daughter. That never changed. A father does not stop loving his child because he has been hurt. But love and trust are not the same thing. Love can survive wounds. Trust has to be rebuilt. And rebuilding trust takes time. Claire eventually admitted something that stayed with me. She said she had started looking at life through Andrew's eyes. She said she became focused on appearances, on what people thought, on whether her family looked successful enough. And somewhere along the way, she stopped seeing the person who had always been there for her, her father. I listened. I wanted to believe every word. Part of me did. But another part of me remembered something important. People reveal their priorities when there is nothing to gain. Before the article, there was no reason for Claire or Andrew to pretend. They had already decided who I was. A man whose best years were behind him. A man whose work was ordinary. A man who should quietly step away. Then the world told them I mattered. And suddenly their opinion changed. That was a difficult truth to accept. Because it meant their respect had not come from understanding me. It had come from discovering my value. There is a difference. A person who respects you does not need proof that you are successful. They respect you before anyone else notices. They respect the person who works in silence. They respect the person who helps without demanding attention. They respect the person who has nothing impressive to show. That is what I had wanted from my family. Not admiration. Not praise. Respect. Simple respect. Eventually, I made a decision. I stopped trying to convince people of my worth. For most of my life, I had carried the responsibility of making things work. At my company, in my family, everywhere. But I finally understood that some things cannot be repaired by one person alone. A relationship requires two people. A family requires everyone to care. One person cannot carry the entire weight forever. So I started living differently. I spent more time doing things that brought me peace. I mentored younger engineers at work. I helped people who reminded me of myself when I was starting out. People who worked hard but did not always receive recognition. I wanted them to know something I had learned the hard way. Your value does not disappear because someone fails to see it. I became involved in community projects around town. Not because I wanted attention, because I wanted my remaining years to mean something. I had spent decades building machines, solving technical problems, creating systems. But now I wanted to build something else. A life that belonged to me. A life not measured by how much I could provide for others. A life not dependent on whether people appreciated my sacrifices. For the first time in many years, I allowed myself to enjoy simple things. Morning walks, quiet evenings, the sound of rain against my windows. Things I had ignored while chasing responsibility. Things I had convinced myself I did not deserve. Looking back now, I do not regret helping Claire. That is important. I do not regret being a good father. I do not regret paying for her education. I do not regret helping her build a stable life. Those choices reflected who I was. And I refuse to let someone else's lack of appreciation change the meaning of my actions. But I do regret something. I regret waiting so long to realize that love without respect becomes painful. I regret believing that if I gave enough, people would automatically understand. They do not. Sometimes people only understand what they had after it is no longer guaranteed. Sometimes people only appreciate the foundation after they have already built their lives on top of it. Claire and I still speak. Our relationship is not what it was. Maybe one day it will be stronger. Maybe it will not. I have learned not to force things that cannot be forced. I cannot make someone value me. I cannot demand someone see my sacrifices. All I can do is live in a way that respects myself. Andrew eventually apologized again. This time I believed he meant it. But forgiveness does not mean forgetting. It does not mean pretending the damage never happened. It means accepting what happened and choosing not to let it control the rest of your life. That is what I chose. I chose peace. Not because they deserved it. Because I did. The man they dismissed was never worthless. The father they overlooked was never invisible. The engineer they mocked was never ordinary. I was always the same person. The only thing that changed was that they finally noticed. And maybe that is the hardest lesson of all. Some people will only recognize your worth when they see someone else recognize it first. But your value was never created by their approval. It was there from the beginning. So now I ask you this. If you spent your entire life giving everything to the people you loved, and they only respected you after discovering what you were worth, would you still open your heart the same way? Would you forgive? Would you forget? Or would you finally choose yourself? Was I wrong to stop explaining my value? Or was walking away from their judgment the only way I could finally find peace?